I've just come out of the last event of International Energy Week, and there was 4 massive areas of impact this week. There was the implications of the Ukraine-Russia conflict. There was how 2025 is going to be the biggest year in nuclear history. There was how the change in energy majors is massively changing following the week. And then there's the massive debate in aviation about what next for SAF. And also we'll mention a little bit the parties we went to. Listeners, the implications of Russia-Ukraine. Not only have we had International Energy Week, but we've had the incidents in the Oval Office, and it's fair to say there is not a day that goes by where there is not another story coming out of the Ukraine conflict. To be very clear, at Wolf Power Club, we absolutely support Ukraine to the hilt. But the fascinating thing about International Energy Week, you heard multiple implications of the situation. I think the first thing that will probably surprise listeners is when I went to the S&P Platts Global Forum is actually how we've had such stability in oil barrel prices since the conflict has started. Although the initial few weeks there was obviously a lot of panic about where supply chains would go, within a couple of months of the conflict, and we're now coming up to the 3-year mark, we actually got to a situation of where the barrel price has settled around that $75 point. To the point, I remember previous years going to S&P Platts, London Energy Forum, where the guesses on what the following year's energy price would be way out. Whereas this time, actually over 2/3 of the conference had predicted 12 months ago that the fuel price would be between $70 and $85, and they actually joked at S&P Platts that they'd close those brackets to make it a little harder. But again, most of the market felt that the fuel price in 12 months' time will be somewhere around the $75 mark. So that might mean that one of the things is that actually, although the politics is all over the place, the world has found alternative supply chains. And the other thing that's very interesting is there's still a lot of spare capacity on energy and fuel. There's a lot of spare capacity out in Saudi Arabia. That was one of the things that came out from it. But where I think the real impact of Russia-Ukraine is actually the support you felt International Energy Week from the room when we heard Maxim, the CEO of DTEK, which is the largest private energy company in Ukraine, has over 55,000 workers. And rather than me saying what he said, please listen to Maxim now tell you his side of the story about what's happened to their company in the last 3 years.
And now it sounds our energy powers life. Because now we probably see it a bit different, especially after 3 years since full-scale invasion. What is life? How important energy is life? Our company has been attacked more than 200 times since February 2022. In July 2024, about 90% of our generation capacity was damaged, destroyed. But daily attacks don't stop us to keep fighting, and we call it energy war. And I think we are winning this energy war, going through third winter during full-scale invasion.
I think it's fair to say, guys, I was virtually speechless and pretty emotional after hearing that in the hall. And the reason I was is that many of us have commercial targets that we're going to beat, we're going to miss. And that's one of our biggest stresses in life. We're stressing about recruitment. Certainly nothing I've ever had stress about is, does my power station have walls on it? I've never had stress about the safety of 55,000 people at once. Obviously, like lots of us listening to this podcast, have the stresses of what happens to your team day to day. But when you listen to that, over 200 ballistic missile attacks in under 3 years, you realise what that company's going to do. We want to have a dedicated podcast about Ukraine, and we will try and get Maximo back in. He very kindly said when we met up afterwards he'd like to join us. But I think the underlying message, therefore, is that Ukraine, and it was amazing, he ended his speech to the whole of conference saying he was actually full of hope because even with all those challenges, they'd kept a constant power supply. And I think that is what I love. They've brought in generators, they've brought in supply, and they're still operating that power grid and that energy system despite the relentless activities from Russia. And therefore, we salute what the Ukrainians are doing. We salute what DTEK are doing. And actually, it then expanded across the week at International Energy Week about people's relationship with Russia. I still think the majority of people at International Energy Week view the idea of doing business with Russia as an absolute no and sanctions in place. However, what has changed, and the podcast is never going to step away from the reality of the situations, is that it's very clear that a couple of things. One, it was made clear to us that actually there's never been sanctions on pipeline gas from Russia. So that is still being used. What was also an interesting development was that pre-Ukraine conflict, Russia exported about 150 billion tons of cubic gas. Now, what the economists were saying, that they feel that the language from certain regimes, and they are looking at America here, where essentially sanctions might be changing, there's no definites yet, but where they are forecasting that in the next 12 months is that although not all of that will return to those countries that have got sanctions, there was a definite uneasiness and a recognition, though, that potentially maybe a third of that will return. So I think it's very, very clear that people still see a role of Russian gas. I think that it's been very, very clear from the French and British governments, they don't see wanting a use of that and looking to invest in other technologies that mean we can go away from that. But it was a point that was very difficult to stomach. On one hand, in front of us, we had someone who'd had the pains and reality of running the largest private energy company. And then you have this other part of where the market is talking about. And as we know, throughout this conflict, there's been substantial purchases from the likes of India, from the likes of China, replacing suppliers with Russian suppliers because of competitive prices. So I think that one of the takeaways and one of the realities and impact is that it looks like that potentially, as a conclusion, may or may not happen in Ukraine, Russia, the energy world is starting to think about allowing Russian gas back in, meanwhile having full support behind the Ukraine energy company. This is one of the dilemmas you see with geopolitics and energy. Energy is normally engineers that want to get on with each other and do business with each other. Geopolitics, there's many things going on with it and we can't control. It was very, very moving, and I cannot wait to have Maxim on the podcast to give his side in depth of what's happened in that country and to its energy sector. Secondly, guys, we talked about the next big area of debate and discussion at International Energy Week was from Fatih himself, the leader of the International Energy Agency, and declaring that it's going to be the biggest year for nuclear power in its history. The most nuclear power has ever been used in the last 12 months. And this is the areas about why Fatih feels that nuclear power is going to be massive in 2025.
Electricity generation will be the highest in the history. So we have seen the nuclear generation globally, a lot of zigzags, but 2025 will be the highest in the history. Second, as we speak now, ladies and gentlemen, 70 gigawatts of nuclear power plants around the world is under construction. And this is the highest amount of power plants constructed in the last 3 decades. More than 40 countries have firm plans to expand or for the first time building new nuclear power plants. Again, the We have never seen this since 30 years. And finally, we have made a report on nuclear power in January, released in January. For this report, we talk more than 10 key SMR companies. More than 12. We have, if I may say so, scrutinized their numbers, their projects, their assumptions. Even though we may not be as optimistic as they are, we think around 2030 we may see the SMRs commercially hitting the market. And many of us may know that there is a long queue, the order queue of SMRs for some companies around the world.
Wow, how exciting from Fatih. I am a child of nuclear family. I spent most of my childhood going to nuclear centres. And when you hear that actually we've used more nuclear power in the last 12 months than any point in history, it makes me very, very excited. I think the other reality is that the barrier to entry for nuclear has always been actually at what price point does it come cost effective. And I think that as you see society gearing up for a raft of carbon taxes and 3 different scopes, you have a feeling that this will suddenly make nuclear power a very attractive option in terms of being able to mass supply huge amounts of the population at low carbon intensity, and also the ability to give national security to countries, as quite often the raw elements of the nuclear process are in more stable territories in the likes of Australia and Canada than in other parts of the world. So I have a feeling then we hear about the entrepreneurial spirit, the small reactors, getting stuff up to power and onto the grid in a quick way, just makes you realise that actually from International Energy Week, there's a huge amount of investors wanting to put money into nuclear. There is Western governments looking to reopen the discussions on nuclear. And you actually have a situation where you think that actually in 2025, this is going to be the renaissance of nuclear power. And essentially that more governments and more companies will be getting onto it and will be a key part of the supply chain going forward. I think let's watch this space. I think we've seen in the UK there's a big drive to get more people into nuclear, and at the podcast we look to be covering that further. But as Fatih always said, this is the biggest year for nuclear power ever, and it's great to hear such a positive impact message coming out of International Energy Week as we go forward. The next area we're looking at is how has the spend in the big energy companies change, and this was probably the oh wow moment of International Energy Week. So British Petroleum, one of the big majors, obviously had its markets day right in the heart of International Energy Week on the Wednesday of the International Energy Week, and it was a fascinating set of announcements they made, and I'll just go through their announcements now of what they said in their thoughts and ideas, and this was big impact. So the first is that they were strategy-wise fundamentally resetting and reallocating capital to grow cash flow and returns. The message underneath that basically is anything that has a slow return on capital and slow cash drive isn't going to be their focus point in the same way that it has previously. Now, this is massive. If you think about the 20-year journey of BP, and at one point they were talking about beyond petroleum, but essentially there has been a sense, not just BP this week, but other international energy companies, that the take-up of consumers of renewables, the paying of maybe extra cost of renewables, has not been seen, and therefore they aren't going to be going as gung-ho. And basically the message is that although they've got energy expertise, they should not be footing the bill for markets that are not there. I'm sure that's going to create much debate and discussion. It then led into the second bullet point of their announcement, and it said that they were growing their upstream. And upstream is obviously oil and gas, and they're looking to invest £10 billion per annum to strengthening their portfolio. And that means basically production to increase by 2.3 to 2.5 million barrels of oils a day by 2030, and then an additional 2 billion operating cash flow in 2027. So if you think about that numbers, that means one of the largest investments in BP's history in growing upstream. And I'd actually say what that meant in London, there was huge excitement. Obviously, originally, International Energy Week came from International Petroleum Week, but I think it's fair to say that people have always felt with energy transition that there's still a long way and still clean ways and better ways that you can deliver oil and gas. And the big message was about growing upstream, not just from BP, but across the board. The next bit is focusing on downstream. For those of our listeners who aren't a foe with that, essentially upstream is your exploration side, where you're physically going into the earth or the start of the process, hence upstream, and downstream is the end product, is B2C. And it was this driving in growth and improving performance. They talked about the performance of high-grade fuels, they talked about the performance of Castrol, and they were hoping to get an extra cash flow by 2027 from Castrol and BP petrol stations of 3.5 to 4 billion. But again, what's interesting about that, prior to this year, many energy companies have done, potentially trials of taking petrol stations to fully electric or looking at that. Obviously, it's slightly different with lubricants because you need lubricants for many different functions. But again, it's a fascinating message that they see downstream growth in petrol stations and Castrol coming to the market. Then they talked about disciplined investment in transition. And what that is basically referring to is that for a green investment, I think it can no longer be a PR project. It no longer can be a sort of puppet of various international world government policies. It has to stand on its own feet. So what they talked about was selective investment in biogas, biofuels and EV charging. And the whole point about selective basically means, those that will help towards PBIT and cash flow. They also talked about capital light partnerships in renewables, focus investment in hydrogen, CCS. As we know, in the northeast of England, they're still committed to that 18 billion up there that they're putting in, and an investment in transition business of around 1.5 to 2 billion per annum, and over 5 billion per annum and this is over 5 billion per annum lower than previous guidance. So you can see a big drop there from nearly 7 billion down to 2 billion. That's a massive significant play, and it's something we're not going to downplay on this podcast. I think it's a real potential challenge for energy transition because so much has been relying on energy majors digging in from funds from energy sources to fund it, and yet the rest of the customer base is not becoming. I totally understand where the boards of energy companies are coming from. I appreciate that there might be pushback and feedback saying that this is not great long-term planning, but I actually think there is a very clear thing. When it comes to energy, you also have to look at timescales, and basically what BP is saying is that timescale from 2025 to 27 and that timescale from 25 to 30 is that there's way more customer base still requiring oil and gas related products, and therefore we cannot be so hasty to return it. And then essentially they are in terms of an update of their financial framework, talking about reducing annual capex spend to 13 to 15 billion in 27. They're targeting significantly higher structure cost reductions of 4 to 5 billion by 2027, 20 billion of divestments by 2027, and this is various things that are going to reduce net debt. They're targeting the Castrol reducing its net debt by 14 to 18 billion by the end of 2027, and then a resilient distribution to shareholders, and a guidance of improvement of 30-40% of operating cash flow. So you can see that there's a drive on financial frameworks. The other fascinating thing was that a passion about AI. So BP on the live stage at International Energy Week said how the investment in AI, the reduction in downtime, the reduction in their cost base, the reduction of push had actually led to their state producing 40,000 barrels more per day. And therefore, I think many energy companies were looking at this thinking, this is the time where actually we need to start investing in AI to really drive strategic growth at a lower cost point. And then we looked at the final point was growing free cash flow and returns, targeting a growth of 20% compound annual growth in adjusted cash flow to 2027, and the returns on average capital employed in terms of their ROCE at greater than 16% by 2027. So in very, very simple terms, when you talk about ROCE like that, is that for every pound they spend on capital employed, they're looking for £1.16 back. If you compare that to the current high street banks in the UK, you put £1 in, you get about £1.03.5 back. So that's where they're saying that the energy industry potentially has still the wonderfulness of delivering about 5 times more than what you can get in a bank, and therefore that also showed people the excitement of where energy was. International Energy Week was buzzing in London because I think we could see backers getting rather excited. The other thing that came out though in terms of spend on energy transition, one of our own guests, Abby from National Grid, said it on the podcast, but said it again in the main auditorium at International Energy Week, and is that International Energy Week is going International Energy Week. National Grid is going to be putting 60 billion between now and 2030 into improving energy transition, the energy network, and so on. So it wasn't all doom and gloom. And then I think also what Abby said, which was really great, was that when they had a fundraiser last year, they were able to raise 7 billion in funding, and they were actually oversubscribed for that funding process. So though we can see that the majors are changed that, and it wasn't just BP, we had Equinor also announcing during International Energy Week they were moving timelines on energy transition. And I think there was this clear message that those at International Energy Week are still the largest in energy transition. They're still putting more money in the national governments, but there suddenly is a big focus on cutting projects that aren't delivering. And the main reason that they're not delivering is that the customer base has not come as quick as they thought it would. And I've seen it myself. I've been involved in many transition energy fuels, and there's sometimes a significant time lag. The other thing that was going around in the room was that even very successful transitions like HVO in things like the UK market is really starting to take off. It's almost got price parity with diesel now, but it's come commoditized. So therefore the suppliers, they've taken a massive hit over the last 5 to 6 years on putting infrastructure in, and they're not getting the money back. And then this then led to, I think, one of the most fascinating areas of energy now. And I would say I'm a complete fanboy of SAF, Sustainable Aviation Fuel. And the reason I'm a complete fanboy of SAF is that, as you noticed before International Energy Week, we went around Battersea Power Station asking this awesome double-header question in our street interviews. The first question was, has clean air, has climate change affected you in your life? And everyone's like, yes, the air in London's got worse in my lifetime. And then the second question with the old Evander Holyfield 2-punch was, we said, and how many flights have you taken last year? And the numbers ranged from about 2, 3, 8, 16, 40, 50. So you could see that the passion for flying was still there. And it was clear in the room at International Energy Week and outside, people don't want to give up warm houses. They'll never give up having hot showers, and they'll always fly. But what's exciting about SAF is that essentially sustainable aviation fuel might be the way that we can get flying, but we can also do it sustainably. The impact, though, and if you see this graph that we'll, for our YouTube watchers will see now as we put up on the screen, is that the cost of aviation fuel has been around $2,000 per meter ton, whereas the cost of SAF has been around 3,000. So there's been a massive difference, 1.5 times the price of SAF. Then it was discussed this week about the actual infrastructure, how there's not enough airports that can supply SAF, so that, say for instance, airlines that are international cannot at this stage commit to a complete route or complete part of their sector being powered on SAF. But what we've got exciting coming up is in a few weeks, we've got the author of Sustainable Aviation coming on. So listen to that episode and we're going to delve more into it. The other thing that was raised was the massive capital that's gone into plants. One energy company let me know that they'd put 1.8 billion into a facility in Texas, and yet they're still struggling to get individual customers to profitability, let alone cash flows on the future for that site to work. So I think what people must understand is the energy sector has put huge money into these areas, and we're now struggling to get a return. But it wasn't all work, ladies and gentlemen, at International Energy Week. What we did have at International Week is some of the best parties possible, and I'd like to take this opportunity to really thank a couple of people for some great parties that they put on during International Energy Week. So I'd love to give a shout out to DTEK, had an absolutely incredible day at the Blue Ball in St James's. Everything was flowing, but as well as everything flowing, DTEK also had fascinating development where the company's going to, such an international room. And my daughters were delighted because I was given some wildflowers, and we look forward to growing those. Another great party. It was quite a select crowd, but I had a nice reunion with the guys from 2010 at Mabanaft. It's great to see all their careers going on. It's beautiful to have a traditional City London curry. But the big party that we ended the week at was at Storage Terminals. It was great to be down there with both my teams, my team from Blend and the team from Wolf Power Club. It was a great evening, hosted by Greg and Tracy. There was the 100 most biggest influencers in the storage terminal markets. It was at the bar 12 Knots overlooking St. Paul's, and we just had a brilliant evening discussing energy, discussing storage terminals, and it's fair to say that your host dedicated himself to making sure I was there until the early hours so that we didn't miss anything from International Energy Week. And finally, we met loads of our listeners. It was great to see the passion at the Energy Institute's Young Professional Forum and the network of Powerful Women, where it talks about the growth of women in the industry. There is so many opportunities right now, whether they talk about the 55,000 jobs needed in Britain in the energy transition, or whether we talk about jobs globally. It's probably one of the most exciting International Energy Weeks I've been to in the last 20 years. The industry feels like on the up, and it feels like a perfect time if you want to make your career to come to the energy industry. I hope you've enjoyed this highlights of International Energy Week. I certainly have, and we have a little sing-song to end with that was truly what I experienced in International Energy. Thank you for your indulgence. Keep on subscribing, follow us on LinkedIn, and also on LinkedIn we'll be announcing our competition winner who won £100 of vouchers for Amazon for following us on LinkedIn. Thank you very much, guys.
Mo Salah, Salah. She's got